Let's get to work on our last of the three topics for this test. It's going to be 6.4 gas exchange systems, sometimes called the respiratory system or ventilation system. Alright, so how do different species transport oxygen into their bodies? Now, some animals, such as amphibians, are able to exchange gases through their moist skin. So just literally their skin is how they're breathing. Fish use gills, while mammals, birds, and reptiles have lungs. In this picture, what you're seeing is, yes, a bunch of dead frogs, which are amphibians. And they're dead because of a type of fungus that's growing on their skin. And this is causing them not to be able to breathe. This fungus is called crayfish harbor fungus, but the more technical name is chytrid fungus, which you can see right here, chytrid fungus in the paragraph. It's supposedly starting to wipe out amphibians because it gets on their skin and then it blocks them from being able to exchange oxygen with the environment, and then they suffocate. This is also very common with salamanders, that this fungus is growing on them. And so the idea is that there's this possibility of this fungus, which is often brought in by crustaceans in different harbors, boat harbors around the world. And so it's very hard to control. It's like an invasive species in a way. And the idea is that it could potentially wipe out amphibians before we know it. So focusing on how fish breathe, this is through their gills. And so you can see in this picture here, this upper picture is the gills. And what's happening is there's capillaries inside those gills. So just like in this picture here, you're going to see capillaries. And what's happening is the water is going in the mouth of the fish, like in this picture of the whole fish. The water is going in through the mouth and out the gills. As that water goes out the gills, the oxygen that the water is carrying goes into the capillaries of the gills and passes that oxygen into the fish, while the carbon dioxide that's in the body of the fish is going to exchange into the capillaries as well, but it's going to exit with the water. So the gills are kind of a one-way system where you just have oxygen going inward and CO2 going outward. Our system is a little bit more complicated than that. So land-based organisms have evolved internal ventilation systems, which allow for gas exchange of the blood. So our ventilation system is very efficient, but it is definitely more complex. So let's go through how our system works. So one of the first things I want to clear up is breathing is not respiration, which is really conflicting when you hear the word respiratory system. So we're going to stick with the word ventilation because we also use that word respiration when we talk about cell respiration, which is how animal cells make energy for themselves, if you remember from the cell respiration unit. Now, what's important is to realize that cell respiration cannot happen without ventilation or without oxygen. So the system is necessary, the ventilation system is necessary to support our cells, animal cells, making energy. So ventilation is the movement of air into and out of the lungs in two stages. So inspiration is when you breathe in, expiration is when you breathe out. So think of the beginning of the word to help you remember it. Inspiration, in, expiration, exiting. This is controlled by the movement of your diaphragm and rib cage, which we'll get into more in the lecture. Gas exchange is another large part of the ventilation system. So the exchange of diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from the blood at the alveoli and the respiring tissues. So these are little alveoli sacs that are on the bronchioles of the bronchi tube, which are inside your lungs. Notice there's little capillaries. These blue and red lines, squiggly lines, are wrapped all around these alveoli. So our circulatory system is very much connected to the ventilation system. we would not be able to get that CO2 out of our blood, and we wouldn't be able to put oxygen back into our blood without the ventilation system. So this is where the two systems collide, so to speak, in the lungs. So looking at cellular respiration again, just for a second, remember that cell respiration needs oxygen in order to make ATP. Okay, so cell respiration and the energy needs of cells, tissues, and organs and organisms comes because of the ventilation system, because it needs that oxygen, because it's an aerobic system. Most of it is an aerobic system that we would need the oxygen to make that ATP. So make sure you don't get the terms confused. Respiration versus ventilation in biology. Okay, so understanding one here. Why do we need a ventilation system? Well, we are very large organisms as mammals, and oxygen cannot diffuse directly into all of our cells from the air, and wastes cannot be directly ejected from the body. So it's not like amphibians where their skin is interacting with that air and it's just inhaling in a sense oxygen and releasing CO2. So it's an internal system. Also, because we're land-borne organism, we need moisture in order to make our lungs work. So, because the surfaces of the cells need to be moist in order for diffusion of the gases to go in and out of those cells. Because we are land-borne organisms, our ventilation system is inside of us to keep us moist, unlike a fish who is in the water. Ventilation maintains large concentration gradient barriers between the alveoli and the blood. And we're going to talk about this more further into the lecture, but ventilation, in order to happen, needs a large concentration barrier, and the lungs act for us in that way in order to make it possible for that barrier to be created, for there to be easy movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the alveoli. Okay, so you're going to need to know another diagram. You're going to need to know the the names of the different organs in the ventilation system. So we're going to start with the trachea, which would be this long tube coming down from the mouth. Remember, I think in the Bozeman video for circulation, he talked about how the esophagus runs back behind it, back here. And there's a little flap that prevents food from going down your trachea. So realize there's two different tubes here. We only want air to come down your trachea, okay? So you have the trachea, then it branches into, because you have two lungs on either side of the heart, then it branches into what we would say the bronchi here, into your lungs. And then bronchioles are these little extra branches that are inside the lungs coming from the bronchi. And then on the ends of each bronchi is what's showing in this more enlarged photo are little sacs called alveoli. And this is where the gas exchange is going to happen. There's capillaries, like you can see in this picture here, all wrapped around these alveoli. And you have the arterioles. This is where the arterioles and the venules meet along these at the capillaries, right? And so this is a picture you should learn how to draw. I'm just going to give you a hint right there, showing you that this is the inside of the alveoli sac. And this is the capillary tube wrapped around the alveoli sac. And you can see the oxygen in red dots is inside the alveoli because it's there from when the person breathed in. And it's going to diffuse the oxygen into the red blood cells here, into the hemoglobin of the red blood cells is going to carry that oxygen, and it's going to continue out to back to the heart. Okay, these upper darker blood cells, it's not them, but it's actually the plasma around them is carrying carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the alveoli to then be breathed out when we expire. So you can see how the capillary being wrapped around an alveoli is allowing for that gas diffusion to occur. So the capillaries are very important in connecting our heart, so our blood flow system, and to the lungs where we can get that oxygen. So here's some definitions and some facts about the alveoli. So the alveoli are the millions of thin-walled dead ends of the bronchioles, forming clusters of air sacs acting as the respiratory surface. It's super important that you notice it's thin-walled. This allows for easy diffusion across the membrane, just like capillaries are. It has a large surface area. So the surface area of the alveolar epithelium, which would be like the layer of skin, is only about 100 meters squared, that's a large surface area, so it's 100 meters squared. This means there's lots of space for it to take in those different gases and release the gases it doesn't need. It's thin, like I said, moist. This allows for the gases needed to dissolve before passing the membranes. It's super important that it's moist, or the alveoli will stick together. Think of it like a balloon that's not filled with air, how it sticks together, the walls do. So it's really important that the alveoli sacs are moist. And then rich blood supply. So it has an extensive net of capillaries for transport of gases to and from the alveoli. There are two types of cells in the alveoli. There's the type 1 pneumocytes, which carry out gas exchange. So they are, if you look in this picture, they're on the edges of the alveoli, which is where the capillary are wrapped around it, and they're where the gas will enter or leave through those little cells. So it's pointing them out in this picture. They're right on the edges of the alveoli sacs. Then there's type 2 pneumocytes, which secrete the surfactant that keeps the sides of the alveoli from sticking to each other. So it's decreasing the surface tension. This is super important to keeping the lungs flexible, like I said, and allowing for gas exchange in the slide before. So they're what release that moisture, and then type 1 pneumocytes are what allow for the gas exchange. You're going to need to memorize those. So I told you we'd mention this high concentration gradient again. So let's use that term CG there to represent concentration gradient. So a concentration gradient is a barrier. Think about osmosis, how usually particles move from a side of higher concentration to a side of lower concentration. So the action of breathing in or breathing out creates a pressure difference, which is going to help push across the concentration gradient. So breathing in is going to increase the concentration gradient of oxygen on one side between the blood and the alveoli. And this allows oxygen to then diffuse into the blood, so into the capillary. When we breathe out, that's going to increase the concentration gradient of carbon dioxide now between the blood and the alveoli. So this would be in the capillary, so to speak. And then that's going to allow carbon dioxide to diffuse into the alveoli. So that concentration gradient, working with the pressure of us breathing air in and out in our diaphragm, helps create a pump to push these gases in and out of the capillaries and the alveoli. So there's a confusion here, because remember, the lungs are a little bit different with what artery and what vein interact with the lungs. Because remember, arteries usually take blood away from the heart, and they usually are containing oxygen at this point. But there's one artery in the heart, the pulmonary artery, which job is to take blood away from the heart to the lungs to get that oxygen. So it's kind of opposite of what we would normally think. So that's why you're seeing an arteriole here around this alveoli, because an artery connected to the arteriole, and it's bringing that CO2 and deoxygenated blood here to the alveoli sac. Notice that there's starting to be gas exchange, so oxygen's going into that arteriole, or what I guess we would say capillary at this point, and CO2 starting to transfer in. Anywhere where there's one of these pneumocyte ones, type 1, so these blue are representing. So at the capillary where the arteriole and venule connect down here, you're seeing the gas exchange, and then finally there's now oxygen in this venule, which is rare because usually veins are deoxygenated. They don't have oxygen in them. But remember, the pulmonary vein is one of the only veins that ever has oxygen in it, and it carries that blood back into the heart so that it can be pumped through the left atrium, left ventricle, and out the aorta to the body. So that's why you're seeing the arterial actually having no oxygen here and the venule having oxygen. Okay, how does ventilation occur? So it's controlled by an inverse relationship in your diaphragm. So your diaphragm sits below your lungs, as you can see in this picture here. And when you inspire, when you breathe in, it increases the volume because it stretches out your lungs. It stretches, and your diaphragm stretches down, giving your lungs space to fill up with as much air as possible. When you breathe out, your diaphragm pushes upward, and that's going to decrease the volume, as you can see in this equation here. It's a decrease in the volume. That's why the arrow is pointing down. As the air pushes out, and it helps push that air out of your lungs, that carbon dioxide. So we'd call this an inverse relationship or antagonistic because they're working opposites of each other. When the volume increases, when we breathe in, the pressure technically decreases. You can see this number here. It says 757. It's decreasing. Where over here, when we breathe out, the pressure increases, and that's going to help push out that air. So it's kind of like a partial vacuum, is what they would say. There's also these little muscles because each muscle only can contract in one direction. Okay? So you have multiple muscles that have to work together to allow you to pull that diaphragm down or to push that diaphragm up. So when you look here, for inspiration, we have something called the external intercostal muscle, which is going to contract. So it's opposite of that word inspiration, and then you're going to see external. So that's how I remember. They're kind of opposite for which muscle will help us inspire. Is the external intercostal muscle, which you can see here is this little line between, here's two different ribs, and here's this muscle here, and it's inside, that's why it's there, and then the external one sits on the outside. And that's the one that's going to help us pull down that diaphragm and breathe in. So notice as the diaphragm contracts and drops, and the abdominal muscle is going to relax. So the chest volume increases, pressure in lungs will decrease. Then for expiration, it's the opposite. It's the internal intercostal muscle is going to contract. So it's going to contract and push, and so the diaphragm is now going to relax, and it's going to rise back up. And the abdominal muscle is going to contract. So the chest volume is going to decrease, and pressure in the lungs is going to increase and push that air out. Okay? So when the diaphragm's relaxed, it's sitting up higher against your lungs. But when it's contracted, it's pulling itself down. Okay? So you would think it would push up, but that wouldn't be the case. The diaphragm, when it contracts, it actually pulls down to give you space when you breathe. Okay, so there's a few different ventilation issues that can occur. Asthma is a very common one that a lot of times you find out when you're young, when you're playing and at recess and you start to realize you're having a hard time breathing. This causes the airways to narrow and swell. And what's actually happening is your immune system is reacting to something foreign that you might be breathing in, like dust mites or pollen, cigarette smoke, different vaping toxins. Anxiety even and stress can cause your immune system to trigger this. And you release something called cytokines, which are basically trying to protect you, but they overprotect you. And it starts to swell up and inflame, and it causes you not to be able to breathe. So you get that result is a wheezing or difficulty breathing. And when people take this inhaler, it helps relax that inflammation so that they can start breathing again. So it's actually your immune system trying to help you, but it's overdoing it. Lung cancer is another one. So lung cancer is the uncontrolled growth of abnormal cells in one or both of your lungs. So in this picture here, you can see this cell growth has basically created blockage along those bronchioles, which then decreases the efficiency of your alveoli and gas exchange. So the causes of lung cancer, the number one is actually something called radon gas, which I'm sure a lot of you haven't heard of before, but it's the leading cause of lung cancer in non-smokers. And it's something that's coming from a radioactive element in the ground. So in the United States, a lot of times right before you buy a house, it has to have a radon inspection to see if there's any of this rock material around your home, because it can lead to lung cancer. Smoking, vaping, and secondhand smoke is another way. So because all of those three contain dust and material that can have cancerous or carcinogenic elements to them on that dust or smoke that you breathe in. So it's not exactly the smoke that's causing it, it's the chemicals that are on those smoke particles. So each year about 7,000 adults die of lung cancer as a result of breathing secondhand smoke. Cancer-causing agents at work, so there's lots of different things that could be chemicals that could be in your, that you interact with in your environment, that could be on dust particles that you breathe in, and that can cause you to get sick. Air pollution from different chemicals like cars, gas pipes, things like that, and then also gene mutations. So the consequences are shortness of breath if the cancer grows to block the major airways. It can cause fluid to accumulate around the lungs, making it harder for the affected lung to expand fully when you inhale, and then death. Emphysema is a type of COPD, which stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so COPD. It's a condition in which the air sacs of the lungs are damaged and enlarged, causing breathlessness. So here you can see these are normal lung alveoli, and this would be ones that have emphysema under a microscope slide. So you can see how they're very enlarged. So this can cause shortness of breath due to the overinflammation of the alveoli, and the lung tissue involved in the exchange of gas is impaired or destroyed. The causes of this are cigarette smoking is by far the most dangerous and also the most preventable because it's a choice. Vaping, which also can, because it has nicotine or different toxins in the vaping, increases something called protease enzymes, which they've found in different research recently, because I know this is still a very new way of smoking. And I know it doesn't create that smell that cigarettes have, but it still has that nicotine or toxins in it. And it basically triggers the creation of more protease enzymes, which can cause an enlargement in your alveoli, which leads to emphysema. Deficiency of an enzyme called alpha-1 antitrypsin, which is an enzyme that would help break down that protease enzyme. So you have a deficiency of it, you don't have very much of it. Air pollution, airway reactivity, like from pollen or different allergies. Heredity, often your sex can also be attributed to this. They notice males get emphysema more often, and then age. Okay, so we're going to be doing a lab. I'm going to explain it to you guys next class, but it's one of our practicals that we have to do, and it's called the breathing lab. So I'll be explaining that to you next class. If you could make sure you put your notes in ManageBack, that would be wonderful, and please let me know if you have any questions. We'll talk about it first thing next class. Have a great day, guys.